Well, I want to answer that, I guess, in two parts. The first is this governor and this administration has a major proposal on smoothing our roads. It's a $36 billion 10-year proposal to invest in fixing our infrastructure, and the priority is fix it first stuff, including improving the pavement on our state highway system and local streets and roads. So in the macro, yes, indeed. With respect strictly to the use of cap and trade funds for those purposes, I know there's some academic study that has been done on smoother pavements resulting in better fuel efficiency and improved GHG emissions, and I know that that's come in part out of the ITS program at UC Davis. I think the challenge with it in a competitive sense under the cap and trade program is in terms of the cost per ton of emission, it may not compete very well versus other alternatives. And that is one of the standards we use in awarding projects under the Transit Grant Program. So I'm aware of it. We've looked a little bit at it. I think there's more to be done on it. And I think the issue probably comes down to the emission you get for the amount of investment, the emission benefit you get for the amount of investment.
Quickly back to Secretary Laird. I know down in the Kings there's some tree removal going on now. Is anything planned up here in the Sierra Mountain Conservancy area? Tree removal? The burned trees?
Well, the Tree Mortality Task Force is looking at every piece of the issue, and I expect that there will be, particularly if the money goes forth that's in this budget for it. And the thing about it is that the impact was more severe in the southern part of the Sierra, so I think that's where some of the first priority was. But I think it's really clear we have to do it wherever the issue is, and so we'll be looking at that and moving ahead on it.
Well, lastly, I would like to entertain a kind of a focus on the expenditure of the cap and trade monies that, you know, I've voiced my concern about the continuous appropriation, but the establishing of priorities, I don't want to say something like the State Allocation Board, and I don't want to create another agency of government, but I'm envisioning some tighter controls over the expenditure of that money. And I don't know what that is, but let's just say my mind is working on it, because I think we, the legislature, need to have much more accountability than we've got right now. That's rather more than less. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen. Senator Monning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank you all for your work of your agencies and for answering these questions today. You know, the Paris Conference on Climate Change, unprecedented international global consensus on the need to advance and accelerate the goals that we're discussing today. And California stood among nations as a state, as a model. And so I think it's important that as we drill down and try to look at efficacy and return on investment, that in many ways we have established a model for the world, and it to me underscores the importance of our success in moving forward. I wanted to start with Mr. Almy. I know today's focus is cap and trade, but earlier this week, Governor Brown commented on having an open mind about carbon tax and looking at carbon tax. And I'm wondering if you, and this may be a question for LAO to answer at a later time perhaps, but in looking at implementation of cap and trade, is anybody looking at efficacy of this approach versus potential efficacy of a carbon tax in terms of the acceleration of achieving our goals and the ultimate risk of failure? We're not going to get another chance at this, and so I'm just wondering, in light of the governor's comments, is anybody in your department looking at efficacy of a carbon tax versus this approach?
I'm not sure I'm in a position really to talk about what we would potentially propose. I know that there are areas of our department that look at a whole range of tax reform kind of issues, and it's not obviously just a carbon tax issue, but the state's overall tax structure in terms of the volatility of the state's revenues. So there are a lot of different ideas that my department does look at.
Right. And again, I know that's not the focus of today's hearing. I would just encourage LAO and the administration, particularly in light of the governor's comments, as we move forward implementing cap and trade, I would like to see the metric of what is our timetable and the efficacy under cap and trade. And there are other states and nations who are being successful with carbon tax. And I just think, the governor opened his mind to it earlier this week, and I just think it should be part of our broader discussion as we move forward. So I'd appreciate that from any of you. I did have some specific questions. One for Secretary Rodriguez. You made reference to the Cal Recycle program and impacts based on low oil prices. In my district, we have recycle centers closing, and people writing letters to the editor saying there's nowhere that I can responsibly recycle plastic products. Any response from the state that can address this immediate and hopefully short-term challenge?
Well, two things, and just a quick addendum to Matt Almey's response on carbon tax. Carbon tax was looked at originally, I think, by ARB, and we try and keep Department of Finance out of some of the policy issues sometimes. We will continue to look at that carbon tax and, what works. I'll note that one of our partners in the Pacific Coast Collaborative, as well as in the Western Climate Initiative, is British Columbia. British Columbia has a revenue-neutral carbon tax in British Columbia. So, we're just interested in addressing climate change, and we're always in discussions with other jurisdictions and looking for ideas on what will work. And so that analysis will go ahead. With regard to what we can do with our recycling industry, I haven't been discussing that with Director Scott Smithline. He brought this to my attention, and it really is just the difficulty of the recycling industry competing given the low price of oil right now. And so it is something that we're looking at. Is there something that we can do? I don't know that it would fit necessarily within the grant program that we've described here, though it is something that I would urge us to look at as we're working on this program.
I appreciate that. And again, from a consumer point of view, or for us constituent point of view, we've done so much work to encourage recycling, responsible recycling, and then now we face the frustration of people who cannot recycle the products that they've been encouraged to recycle. So I think finding even short-term alternatives of storage at landfills or something that's can eventually go back into that market. But it's an area where if we depend totally on market forces, we may fall short of important environmental goals and objectives. So thank you for that. My final question, if I could, Mr. Chair, to Secretary Laird. Particularly interested in your comments on forests and management. In my district, the Monterey pine has suffered from the beetle disease and drought, and we have stands of Monterey pine from Cambria north, dead trees, and they present Mr. Almey talked about the benefits of forest management crossing the plain. But they also present these risks now of immediate hazard and high winds and storms, fire hazard, the wind storms knocking these dead trees down on structures. We've been hearing from CAL FIRE in the district and residents looking for relief as to how to address this issue. And I know it's not unique to my district. You alluded to other areas. Any relief in sight for immediate mitigation, particularly around residential areas?
I don't know about immediate mitigation, but I do spend time reminding everybody that it is not just an issue in one part of the state, and that we have to figure out how to address it in places, and I'm intimately aware of what's going on in your home area.
You shared I don't know if you have it at your fingertips, the emissions from the rim fire, and equivalent to how many?
2.3 million cars, and the King Fire the next year was not as many, but it was, the King Fire next year was equivalent to 863,000 cars, 4.1 million metric.
Well, to me, that underscores the cost benefit of investing in fire reduction risk as opposed to these clear greenhouse gas impacts. So appreciate the work.
It's true, and the real thing, I was talking about the difference between the Federal Forest Service and the state, and part of it is that we really have to protect the populated areas and the urbanized areas, and sometimes from fires roaring out from places that aren't even in our control. And so the question is can you do the fuels preparation that are nearest the urbanized areas to demonstrate that you're getting a response for your investment?
Yeah, and I think the challenge in this prioritization that we've done as a legislature and have asked you to implement, and I'm also pleased to hear the emphasis from each presentation about meeting the objectives of investment in low-income communities, disadvantaged communities. But I also think we take a step back, and there is a way to look at which investments result in the greatest protection or reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And I'd have to think in the area of uncontrolled fire, it could be the best return on investment to avoid some of these statistics that are just hard to fathom what that means. But again, I thank you all for your work, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity.
Thank you for your good question, Senator. We have Senators Wolk, Mitchell, Allen, Pan, and Morlock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank all of you for your work and for coming today. Appreciate that. Before I begin, I just want to make a very brief comment. Having been involved with the Senate Working Committee that was looking at cap and trade last year, I want to congratulate or thank you for being responsive to many of the concerns that were raised. So in fact, I think that this cap and trade expenditure plan is a good one. And I think it shows that there was, during all those hearings and discussions and no doubt many, many meetings, that all sides were listening, and I think it reflects that. So I think that's really a positive. You heard my concerns earlier about the reporting issues, and actually Secretary Ross said that part of the evaluation in the Healthy Soils program would be conducted by, or was conducted by, the universities. So it seems to me the universities, I hadn't thought about that, the universities and CSU certainly would be a really good way to have that sort of peer independent review and at a good price. Don't tell them I said that. Okay. However, the other concern that I had raised was about the definition of some of these programs that are new. Do you expect, and anybody can answer this, do you expect to have policy, in what form will these new programs roll out, be further defined? Do you foresee legislation? Do you foresee legislation concurrent with the budget? I mean, Mr. Almy, you want to start with that? Since finance will probably be in charge of that.
Sure. There is a spectrum. The Low Carbon Road program, for example, there actually is trailer bill language for that. That is being proposed, that establishes kind of the types of eligible projects that would be available. The other most common form, and I think it affects every agency here, is there's a public process in terms of developing the guidelines. So a lot of these programs are grant programs. And so as part of the process of formulating them, I think Secretary Rodriguez was talking about the Air Resources Board has this public process where it gets input from the public, and establishes the goals and objectives, the metrics, and then builds upon that in a real public process to define the program and how the grants would be prioritized. I don't know if you want to build on that, but.
Do this?
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Okay, there we go.
He's new here.
He did a good answer. He covered it. When we're doing these programs, we do have a public discussion on the development of these programs, and so there is a discussion of the expectations. We do identify what we expect to get out of these programs as we go ahead. So nothing is being decided in a paneled room somewhere in the bowels of some agency office.
Okay, I'll hold you to that. Two questions. Many of these programs go across departments, require, it seems to me, good coordination. I'm curious about whether, for example, the resources grants, John, if you would speak to this. The initial rounds were, you have DWR, you have Fish and Wildlife, you have forestry and fire protection. Do you have a formal coordinated process or how do you handle the fact that there's so many different pieces to much of this?
Well, I think that each individual department or who has responsibility runs the piece, but as an agency, we try to, in an overview way, make sure that there's some consistency, that they're touching all the right bases, that they have involved stakeholders, that they're doing it in a timely way. My biggest fear the first year, because we had to do all these regulations and different things, is that we were going to come back and sit in this hearing and tell you that we hadn't moved on what had been done in the previous budget process. And so part of our thing was to just crack the whip all the time. Right? We do not want to be in that position. And so there is that global view. And then on one that you didn't ask about, but is related directly, is we have the Sustainable Ag Program, and we were going to look at soils, and soils is going to CDFA, and we are having conversations to make sure that the conservation elements that tend to exist in our ag programs are consistent with the climate smart ag that they're doing, so that there actually is coordination between the departments and both our goals are being met in the process.
Good. Yes.
Okay. Brian, how did you?
All I can say is we're running the program much better than.
Don't take this as a level of my competence in my job, please. I did want to point out the importance of cross-agency coordination on this, and I have a couple of examples on that. One is in establishing the Dairy Digester program. That came after we established a federal-state work group to look at what were the barriers to having more dairy digesters in the state and making sure that we weren't going down a pathway because the technology was good on one environmental issue, but could unintendedly create consequences for air and water quality. So that was a 2-year process working across all of our state agencies that have a role in this, as well as our federal partners. And we mapped it out. We identified redundancies. We identified a tool for consolidated permit review and made sure that we do not lose sight of the very important air and water quality standards that we don't want to sacrifice in pursuing this technology. The same thing is going on right now with the work group across all the agencies that actually have something that touch healthy soils. So that's another way of doing that.
All right. And I'm very pleased.
And if I could add that we do also have the Climate Action Team, which brings together all the boards and departments within the state that have some piece of the climate puzzle. In fact, this afternoon, I'm going back to discuss the agenda for the next Climate Action Team meeting. At those meetings, we will have the discussion of, oh, by the way, the legislature is very concerned about reporting back and getting information back to them on where the emissions reductions are. We've had those discussions in the past. We will continue to have those discussions. And we have those discussions to help the Air Resources Board, which has responsibility for reporting back to you ultimately on where we're achieving our reductions. So we do have that reporting requirement. ARB is taking that seriously. I use the Climate Action Team Forum as an opportunity to assist the Air Board in getting the relevant information from the other boards and departments that are running these programs. And then there, I can tell you, there's a great deal of ad hoc coordination that also goes on as well.
Well, I wanted to thank, oh, yeah, you were going to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add one quick note on SGC's programs. We actually do have a formal coordinating body, a steering committee that does develop the program guidelines for affordable housing and sustainable communities that consists of key staff. We refer to them from each of the agencies. And one thing I want to note that I think is important out of that process is that it's not only intended to facilitate integration across agencies, but also in a public-facing way, how can we better coordinate to encourage better cooperation at the local and regional level for sometimes parties that don't always work well together. And so we find to be a kind of a joint exercise of sorts where there are feedback loops that have, at least in the second round, I think improved the program.
I appreciate the fact that you mentioned that. My last question was that you mentioned having responsibility for easements. You're going to be funding easements. Didn't I hear that? And if so, yes, just yes or no? Yeah, okay, that's what I thought I heard. So forestry is also easements, and I support them strongly. I'm curious about the coordination here, and especially with the local communities, how that, within the agencies as well as with the local communities,
Well,
knowing how controversial.
The easements that he mentioned with regard to agriculture actually administered by us as part of the sustainable ag thing. And then additionally, it's really understood in the healthy forest that there will be a piece of it that are easements. And I think what we did with regard to the ag one was take applications. And part of it was whether or not you're coordinating well with your locals in doing it. And in just refreshing myself for this hearing, I mean, there were some in Butte, Tehama, Monterey County, Sonoma County. They really covered the gamut. And in many ways, the community has set forth in their sphere of influence with LAFCO and in their local general plans where they think that it's appropriate to do this. So just by accepting applications to do that, we're validating a local decision that's been made already as part of their general plan process.
Good. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Mitchell.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. I've got one question for Mr. Winston, and then I just want to really share an observation and welcome and hope to hear from whoever in the panel chooses to respond. First of all, Mr. Winston, I represent Mid-City Los Angeles, and there was a concern expressed to me from a number of sources after the first round of funding, and I'm glad to hear that technical assistance and understand that it was funded this last year. But my question is, why TA only to those who applied first round who didn't get it, as opposed to making TA available to anyone and everyone who was interested, so perhaps we could not have to fail in a round to get the TA that you probably knew you needed in the first place to be successful at all?
Very good question, and thank you. It is an item that we did hear much about. I think answer it in two parts. Maybe the short answer is that absolutely there is a recognition that more assistance is needed to better prepare communities. I think the thinking here in this pilot program, and I think I would stress the word pilot, was to really focus in on those who had already had an understanding, at least initially, of the process, so initial applicants, in order to evaluate methods that work best. So each of the third-party contractors who are now undertaking technical assistance are pursuing different models with regard to providing that assistance and capacity building. And so you have, assistance in terms of filling out the application, but also preparedness to be able to fill out the application. And we still need to, I think, do our work in learning which methods work best. And so I think that's the thinking behind really focusing the scope this year with the intention and the hope that we would be able to expand.
Okay, so then we haven't closed the door, because sometimes pilots here either last into, forever without benefiting from the learning, or a pilot happens one year and then we never hear about it again. So what I'm hearing from you is we haven't closed the door to recognizing the value of TA and that it could on an ongoing basis be available once we get the experience from the pilot. Fair summary?
Correct, that's the intention. Yeah.
Excellent.
And Senator, if I can just add one thing, because even though you asked specifically about that half of it, the agriculture piece was here, and we had the same question, because it was, some people can't compete because they don't have the capacity.
Right.
They come from a disadvantaged community. How in the process do you not screen them out? How do you make sure? So we developed, as part of this, a letter of intent so that people didn't have to have the capacity to do the complete application. They could do a letter of intent. And then if it turns out they clearly met the qualifications, they were a place we'd want to go, they were really dealing with greenhouse gas reductions, then we could zero in on technical assistance because we know they identified something that would work and they didn't have to go through the whole process to get to that point. And that seems to have worked in the round where that happened, but it's just out of that same sensitivity.
I appreciate that. And that aha came to me last summer during our summer recess in my effort to be prepared to come back to the legislature and engage in what, we thought at the time was going to be a conversation around how we expend the first round of dollars. Didn't happen. But in that effort, I, in my district, convened an amazing group. I was surprised about the overwhelming response. And it was a varied group, grassroots organizations, some who should have applied, who didn't because they understood that TA wasn't available and that they probably didn't have the capacity. They didn't meet the criteria. Conservancies, land trust organizations, environmental justice organizations, a very diverse group. And boy, did I get an earful. I must start by saying that. And for me, I had a couple ahas and things that I feel compelled to share with you all. Everyone is clear around the cause. We all can agree, SB 535 lays out for us all very neatly what communities must be supported. And these were representatives from the disadvantaged communities. And so we're clear that economic development opportunities stem from investment in housing and transportation infrastructure development. The growth of good jobs and training in these communities is critical for the urban residents most impacted by industrial emissions. And so the question is, while the whole focus of the Cap and Trade program is to focus on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, how do we balance that with the core fundamental economic needs of a community that are being disproportionately impacted by these emissions? Fair enough? And so they raise some really fundamental issues that question the process by which this program is being rolled out, if indeed we are true to our intent of AB 535 to make sure that communities that are being disproportionately impacted are going to also disproportionately benefit from these resources. Questions like access to the cap and trade funds aren't feasible to the neediest municipalities and their NGO partners. In order to apply, manage, and implement a cap and trade grant or loan, a city must have the staff and budget necessary to develop the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities minimum request of $500,000 for grant funding. The pool of small urban cities with balanced budgets, let alone the capacity to add more admin tasks to their workload, is non-existent. One observation. The ARB is getting $500 million for their low carbon transportation and fuels program. beyond rebates for zero-emission cars, vouchers for trucks and zero-emission trucks and buses, how else is the money going to be spent? Great suggestions like free bikes to low-income communities, electric fleet of vans for nonprofit organizations. How about giving to everyone who is a public benefits beneficiary free transportation vouchers for public transit systems? My takeaway from this meeting was sometimes, and I share many of the concerns my colleagues have raised about, the administration has not laid out for us a clear, consistent plan for how these dollars will be spent, and yet so many of the leaders who are living and doing work every day in these communities don't see a space for themselves at the table to often offer very practical, measurable solutions that might have the most impact, as Senator Mining suggested. They ask questions about workforce development, and is there any particular strategy around making sure that disadvantaged communities have a workforce development strategy that gives them access to the growing green economy? Is there currently any money set aside for innovative project strategies that come from the communities themselves? Those were some of the major takeaways I had, and struck me that the people in the room are the people who should be in the room as we have the conversations about how these programs are going to roll out and why aren't they. Any comments from any of you? I'd appreciate hearing your responses.